Okay, welcome back to day 2 of Building Life Science Adventures 2023. Thank you for joining this morning's session, which is on the topic of which recruiter should you choose. So just a couple of housekeeping points before we get going. If you don't mind keeping your microphones on mute throughout, that would be great. We do, however, like these sessions to be really interactive, so please feel free to pop any questions in the chat box and we will feed them in to the panel. Just to highlight as well that closed captions are enabled, so if you do require that accessibility, they are switched on. And just a reminder that this session is being recorded and all of the recordings will be made available via the app. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Paul Branthwaite, and I hope you enjoy the session.
Thank you, Jasmine. Could we have the first slide, please? Okay, so quite simply, this is the agenda we're going to use. Obviously, introduce the panel, and then we're going to look at both the strategic and tactical delivery of new people or new talent to teams. And also, we're going to consider some of the alternatives to absolute employment, when and why and how that's important. And also, given that recruitment is an art form, is how do you choose the right recruiter for the right sort of work that you're trying to fill. And then we're going to talk about synergies and whether relationships between companies, clients and specific recruitment agencies makes worthwhile. And if we have time, I really do want to talk about some of the elements to do with the candidate side and how they are treated and what their experience is and the sort of considerations that you need to give in terms of how you handle that in a timely and kind manner, because we're talking about people's lives here, but only if we have the time. So introductions first. Next slide, please. So briefly, I'm a senior partner at Transcript, and hands up, we're on the other side of the recruitment divide, in the sense that we provide subject matter experts and operational capability to our clients. So why am I here is that I was a senior level recruiter for about 11 years, operating at the sort of senior director level and above. So I have a great deal of experience of working on the dark side of this particular equation. Rosie.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, so I'm Rosie Armand. I'm HR Director at F-Star Therapeutics, which is a clinical stage biotech based in Cambridge, developing immunotherapies for cancer treatment. I've always been predominantly in sort of HR generalist roles in a number of different industries, so always quite heavily involved in recruitment, whether that's kind of external partners or internal TA teams.
Thank you, Rosie. Sean?
Thanks, Paul. I'm Sean. I work for Bencheye. I'm a principal talent acquisition partner. I've been in recruitment for over a decade now. Similar to Paul, a lot of my experience was over the dock side of agency, and then in recent years moved over to more of the talent acquisition role, working in as part of the business and to ensure a good recruitment process for those looking for work here at Bencheye.
Thank you, Sean. And last but not least, Soraya.
Good morning. I'm Soraya. I'm a human resources consultant at Taylor Vinters. And I guess my main experience is really working within the scale-up and start-up biotech ecosystem within sort of the innovation economy, and really supporting organisations to, build their teams through their talent. So a lot of experience, building internal teams and working on recruitment, talent acquisition across the board, from very senior level through to less experienced roles.
Thank you. Some of the questions I'm going to ask, obviously I'll go to the panel more frequently this, but there are one or two that I'm going to cover myself, and you'll see why as we go through. So next slide, please. So I thought I'd first make that point about why do we recruit in the first place, and obviously either a gap has appeared, or from a strategic point of view, an expansion of the organization is required. And the ideal it would be to get the best people we can possibly find, both operational and managerial class, to fit against that overall overarching plan. However, that's often, as Macmillan said, events, dear boy, when asked why things were so difficult to be a politician. Well, the same is true for all companies, is that people leave, people fall under a bus. I'm not saying this is in a pejorative sense, but keep staff also go on maternity leave, and that is quite often an opportunity to not only deliver cover, but also think about can we expand at the same time? So although you're covering an individual who will come back, there's also an opportunity to move that organization a bit further forward or expand on it. So the elements are mapped out here. Crisis or planned. Are we clear what we need, etc., etc., etc. And Rosie, I thought I'd come to you first to think about the reality that in terms of company recruitment, are these things which are always on your mind, or are some more important than others?
Yeah, and I think most organisations will be doing some sort of kind of strategic workforce planning, and I think that will vary how far out they can do that for. So I guess some will be doing that kind of for several years, some will only be able to do that for the next few months. But I think that kind of activity is going to be thinking about everything from developing your talent internally, succession planning, introducing new talent pools. I think it's trying to understand what skills are you going to need and what talent do you need in the coming months and years. But I think the challenge is how far can you go with that as an organization, and recruitment is kind of one small part of that. Okay, we now identify a need where we need to bring that skill or resource in from externally, but it does play a part in a whole broad range of activities, actually, of how are we going to develop or bring in-house the skills that we need for the future of our organization, and then ultimately how are we going to keep them. And that's kind of a big cycle of conversations that I think is important. That's a regular agenda, actually. And I think to have those people plans and how long you set that out for, say 12 months, they need to be looked at regularly. And I think certainly the last few years, but this war for talent is not a new term, but I think the last few years has really kind of hit home that we need to constantly be looking at what those plans look like, whether that's because you're changing as an organization or actually externally things are changing quite quickly. So I think there's a whole number of things that are being considered before you get to the point actually of, okay, we now need to recruit for those roles. So I think some organizations just default into, okay, we're going to have to get this externally. But if you're doing that kind of workforce planning well, then there's always other avenues as well that you're exploring and you're developing that talent internally.
Thanks, Rosie. Sean, obviously we were talking about, as Rosie set out, some of the parameters and the how you should be thinking about it, but it almost at a tactical level. One of the issues I always found during recruitment is that teams that we were recruiting into were unsure how to attract talent, and beyond that is how to keep them happy, etc. So what sort of advice do you give your internal teams on finding, not so much finding, but bringing on board and keeping people on board?
Yeah, good question. Firstly, Rosie, you're absolutely right. That war for talent is raging ever more still at the moment. So that falls nicely into how I would explain it. But you have to bear that in mind throughout this whole process, that there are so many options available to people at the moment. So having an attractive process, having an attractive way to come into the business, and your first touch point with the people that you're looking to hire or applying is their first introduction into your company. And that's the first way you kind of attract people to your business, with a smooth process, a tailored hiring process as well, tailored interview process. And that doesn't just stop when they come, when they've signed on the dotted line. As part of like an internal process, you need to look at onboarding, you need to look at internal mobility, you need to look at all these things. And that comes through like a really strategic, tailored recruitment plan or people plan to have for people, not only when they at their first touch point with you, but further on down the line, a 30, 60, 90, plan for when they come into the business, because it's not just as recruiters, it's not just like a stopgap once you've put that bum on that seat. It becomes a lot more in depth after that as well.
Thanks, Sean. And last, Soraya, obviously, given what you do, any further comments? But I want to also take that last point about the process and how long it can take is an important factor. So any comments, or would you add any other dimensions to what's already been said?
Yeah, I think just to add finally, in terms of the actual question is, why do we recruit? And I think the reality is there is a goal and a strategy that we want to deliver on. So thinking about, what is it, what's the output and the outcome that we're looking to deliver on? So therefore, what talent do we need? And being really clear about that up front before going out to market to look to those candidates and looking for that talent is really, really important. And then it flows into, everything that Rosie and Sean was saying about thinking about your process, tailoring that, but also being clear, to make your final point, Paul, around timelines around that, to think in terms of that old cliche that time kills all deals. Rosie mentioned it's a war on talent. It's very challenging and very competitive out there, and we need to be thinking as employers, attracting that talent around what's going to set us apart from the competition. So being clear about that and making sure that it's actually a real lived experience for the existing employees, because they're your greatest marketing, attraction, recruitment tool you can probably have. So I think thinking about, what's that lived experience for your existing employee base, and are they able to support how you recruit, and that experience that they have will be lived by the onboarding employees. But thinking about being really rather quick in your timelines, because people have multiple offers, counter offers, and if people have a shall we say loose process, you're going to lose that talent. The candidate won't feel respected or wanted, and they have multiple choices these days. So I think being quick around your processes, you can still make good decisions in a short time frame. You don't need sort of a 3 months recruitment process to hire the right talent.
And if I can add to that, it goes to what you said at the beginning, Soraya, you need to have a firm idea of what you want and when you want it. Because if if the decisions internally aren't clear, then that timeline starts to drift away, and you get nowhere. And I would also add there's a need for some degree of flexibility. Because of the tightness of the talent pool, but also sometimes you'll find somebody who doesn't quite fit, but actually could extend competence within the organization. So the ability to shuffle around that to fit the individual, and this is usually more amenable in processes for mainstream pharma, oddly enough. But even biotech should think about am I getting more than I bargained for, and is that a good thing? But anyway, moving on to the next point is slide, please. There are risks to getting this wrong. I mean, I've outlined some of the elements that sometimes we completely minutely define what we're looking for. That's never going to be found. I mean, I was once asked to hunt for somebody for GSK, and we worked out there are only 5 people on the planet who have the skill set. Well, that's somewhat slightly diminishes your pool. But the other thing is, when I talk about flexibility, there's also flexibility up and down. There's also the risks of, whether your own internal talent pool, they should be considered, but if they're not being considered, how do you manage that expectation? And also sometimes the powers that be are demanding something which is frankly untenable. So I'm going to come to you again, Soraya, in terms of how do we provide those reality checks with the in-house hierarchy. how do you deal with purpose and fit, and then obviously any risks in not doing it right?
Well, I think, you know, the reality check is, if you want to attract talent, you have to make a realistic job description. There is no such thing as a unicorn. It's a mythical creature, but we have very real talent that we want to attract. So I think being really clear about what that day-to-day role is going to look like, but what are the opportunities for development, you know, and being really real about that, and having that conversation. You know, you mentioned, you know, what's the internal talent pool, you know, and can we elevate that? So I think with every role, we want there to be an ability for the individual to grow and add, as opposed to fit, because you lose some of your diversity then when you think about in terms of it always being a fit. But I think, you know, what can they add to the culture of the organisation? How does the individual's motivations to turn up and do what they do align with the organisational purpose? So you're always thinking in terms of dual purpose there. And I think, you know, so that there's that strength in the job description that you're writing and how you talk about it to the candidate, and also with the managers that are hiring as well. You know, yes, they want to have this wish list to make it the most attractive role, but then, you know, the reality is, and Rosie will have experienced this, you know, time and time again, that you start having performance issues or engagement issues with an individual, and the classic phrase is, that's not on my job description. You know, so we really want to be mitigating those risks and sort of time drains, for want of a better phrase, upfront when we're attracting the talent. So to do that, you need to have this very real job description. And I think when we're thinking about culture and purpose, you know, culture is fundamentally a set of beliefs, behaviours and habits that an organisation forms. So therefore, how do we look for that and test that in a candidate when we're speaking to them, and understanding, again, like I said, their motivations, i.e. what's their purpose and does it align to the organisational purpose, and can they both meet in the middle so that the individual purpose supports the overall delivery of the goal. But I think always think in terms of add as opposed to fit, because organisations are living, breathing things, and they change all the time. So we don't want people who fit and then can't change or move with the times. And so thinking about, you know, in terms of add, I think is really important these days.
Thank you, Soraya. Sean, obviously you're faced with demands from the line teams. I mean, do you find that providing them with a reality check is easy? Do they listen? What can you do to ensure that as Soraya said, you know, it is about the overall and the potential that is also important?
Yeah, good question. Hiring managers would always remind me of, and if no one else has done this, when you're younger, during Christmas, your mum would give you the Argos catalogue, and you'd have to pick out all the presents you wanted for Christmas. And you'd, as a kid, you would sit there and go, on that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, that. And realistically, that doesn't work within a certain spectrum, because you don't have like any parameters to it. You're just trying to pick as much as you want. And sometimes hiring managers get a bit like a kid at Christmas when they're picking stuff for a job spec. So it's kind of giving them a bit of a reality check and kind of giving them the parameters you actually need for the role. That's probably quite a poor example, but it's something that was always stuck with me when I think about these kind of things. So when you're going through the role, realistically, it's going, what are the core fundamentals? You know, what's realistically a nice to have, and what was a need to have, and where can we be flexible? Because, like we say, Soraya, you know, the unicorn is a mythical creature. It does not exist, but a good person does exist. A good candidate does exist. A great fit for the job does exist, and we need to be realistic about what a great fit is, rather than perfect. Because again, like, I think perfect is a mythical creature. No one's perfect. We're obviously always learning and adapting. So I think a level of like kind of understanding and a realization that, you know, we're not going to get a unicorn, and finding out what's nice to have, what's a need to have, and what's a must have, and breaking it down to those areas, and kind of setting up the level of expectation. If we can't find this, where can you be flexible? Would you take this? You know, if it's a cloud, let's say, for example, at the moment, we're looking for cloud engineers, if, we use GCP, if there's not a lot of people with GCP, would you look at someone with AWS experience and train them up? That kind of flexibility in terms of a job spec internally, that's something we do. A bit of a convoluted answer, but yeah, flexibility would be my biggest takeaway from that, with managers, and trying to figure out what flexibility looks like for them in what areas.
I like the visual, Sean. I was wondering whether some of our colleagues always think about going into the Fortnum and Mason catalogue rather than the Argos catalogue, but that's a different thing. Rosie, the fallback position element, and indeed the reputational risk as well, is that something that is at the forefront of consideration, or is that simply something that you just have to live with?
Yeah, no, I think it needs to be a consideration. I think there's a lot of, certainly in some of our industries, they're very small and people talk, and if they've had a bad experience, whether that's through a recruitment process or once they're in the business and after they've left, I think those sorts of things can circulate and can cause quite a lot of damage and create that reputation. I think there's also, even before that point, I mean, Soraya's already touched on some of the disruption that just having individuals in the business that you haven't been aligned in on kind of what you needed, and therefore they've come in, and there's an engagement piece, there's performance, there's retention, all of those issues. But actually, even I think, kind of going back to Sean's point around those upfront conversations and getting aligned on what are the must-haves and what are the things that you can be flexible on. Those conversations, I think people always, they kind of get the nod to hire and they dust off an old job spec and they kind of want to crack on. I think there's so much value in getting the key stakeholders in that role, not just the hiring manager, but those that are going to be working with those individuals and getting aligned internally on what it is that you're looking for. And I think one of the most damaging things is you get so far down a recruitment process and you've got a bunch of candidates that are great, but that none of them are right, and you kind of have to go back to the drawing board. And if you'd had those conversations up front, then you would have all been aligned on kind of what the options would be along the way. So I think there's definitely that sort of reputational damage that happens just through the recruitment process, but then ultimately, through the employee cycle, and once people have left, that definitely is can have an impact on an organization and should be considered.
It's a slightly tangential question, going to what you said there, Rosie. Do you think about the 360-degree view of the getting an input into what the candidate should look like?
Yeah, definitely. And I think kind of that, like I said, that 360 perspective and the key stakeholders, I think even from Soraya touched on it, from a diversity perspective, I think it's quite easy to slip into that, or the hiring manager will just kind of recruit what they think they need for their team. And actually, in a lot of our organizations, roles are very much involved in working across a matrix or projects, and I think it's important to get those kind of a rounded viewpoint on what those skills are, both for now but also longer term. So I think it's really important that you get that input from kind of a rounded perspective, definitely.
Thank you. So okay, now we have a strategy and a strategic need, and you as an organization have determined it must at least consider an outsider. We're going to look at your options and what are the upsides and downsides. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is about the tactics, and in truth, it's all about circumstance. What are you looking for? Almost determines how you look for it, etc., etc. And there is an aspect of doing it yourself, and we will talk to Sean about that, but also Rosemary has some experience of DIY, as it were, recruitment. I'll just say that I don't think a recruitment route is necessarily exclusive. However, if you do work with some recruiters, they may expect all candidates to be processed through them. I don't have a problem with that because it gives you a continuity of triage, but it is something that you may need to consider if you're getting really good recruits from outside your recruiter space, as it were, from friends and family I mentioned on here, and whether or not somebody just pops in out of the blue on the website. But there are other resources, and we'll get to that in a second. So Sean and Rosie in particular, do you think that doing it yourself is tenable for all companies? Is it burdensome in that sense, or is it just far too easy to pick up the phone and go to an agency? So Sean first.
I think it is all circumstantial, if I'm honest. Look, if you're a business like ours and you've got 400 plus people, and you've got a TA team and you've got HR and you've got all these different functions to be able to do so, yes, you should be recruiting internally first and doing it yourself, because I always got this one bit of great advice. If you've got 400 people in the business, you've got 400 recruiters. You've all got like people advocating for you. However, look, I do see the flip side of that. If you're a smaller function without the function to be able to do so, yes, an agency is, and sorry to use this term, a necessary evil. It's a cost, but it's what's going to cost you more in the long run, not being able to hire this role, or not getting the right people in that could have long-term affect the business. So I think it is a bit all circumstantial, depending on what your business looks like, what your model looks like. Do you have the budget for it even to begin with? There's a lot of kind of factors within there. I would say if you can do it yourself, I'm a little bit biased, obviously, because I do it myself internally. So I'm obviously gonna say that. But I do see, and I've worked agencies, so look, I know that I see the value in agency as well. But yeah, it really does depend. Like how many times from an agency perspective have you had a call with a client and they've said, I can't afford to work with an agency, and that's fair because some people cannot afford to work with an agency or don't have the time to put that kind of effort into working with an agency. And yes, Paul, to talk on your point as well, I think you should work with one particular agency and not, pay and spray around different agencies. I think an exclusive model does work, especially if you're working with a specialist within a certain area. But to round back up, definitely circumstantial.
Okay, and Rosie, because you may have had more experience with externals than Sean has in recent times, although he's biased because he used to be one. So your thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of agree with everything Sean said, and I suppose coming from a perspective of maybe smaller organizations that don't have internal talent acquisition teams or a lot of internal resource, I think that's the kind of starting point, is what resource do you have to manage that internally, and what processes do you have in place that, kind of going back to what we touched on before on having efficient and effective recruitment processes that aren't going to take 7 weeks to get to interview stage. Do we have the internal capacity and skill set to do that? I think there's a big piece around this kind of recruitment culture. I think some organizations really, really value the power of recruitment and doing it well, and that is reflected through all levels of leadership and management, and therefore your managers can play a really strong lead in recruiting for those positions. Equally, I think there's a lot of organizations where it's a real challenge to do that in a good way. And so I think it's as well culturally, like how well does your organization buy into the importance of recruitment and good recruitment processes? And I think all the other things that Sean touched on, can you afford to do it? How quickly do you I think for smaller organizations as well, it's that outreach. For a lot of companies, they aren't particularly, they may not be well known, and so just they don't have that reputation externally to be able to do that directly. And you can use partners to help tell your story and to attract those candidates as well, where you don't particularly have a lot of external communication or kind of PR activity happening. So I think it really does depend as well on kind of what resource you have, what capabilities you have, and to kind of get that going.
I'm going to, in due course, Soraya, I am going to come to you to talk about culture and how that can be changed, because I think what Rosie just pointed out is extremely important. But I just want to, for purposes of keeping to time, just briefly go into the area of alternative resources, and this comes to one level about strategic thinking about, are you recruiting for the right reason, and are you recruiting to fill a gap? Is that temporary? All the rest of that stuff. So, but also, a recruitment process can take a long time. I mean, never mind the actual interviewing process, finding and interviewing, etc., etc. A lot of certainly senior level people may have a 3-month or even a 6-month notice period. So there is a period between recruitment, particularly when you're, shall we say, reacting to events, as against a planned one, which is obviously what Rosie likes to see, and the actual boots on the ground, being able to come up to speed, etc. So in certain circumstances, it can take sometimes between 9 months and a year between initial thought and actual person being truly productive. And what do you do in the interim? And again, I was speaking to personal experience recently. Well, I say recently, over the last 15 years. Sometimes we find that the alternative resource stays around longer than somebody that you recruit on permanent staff. One of my colleagues who's just retired was in one organization for 15 years, and he was the single longest lasting member of staff in that team, by a margin. So it's that balance of external resource, either temporary or long term, as against recruitment, needs to be put into play. And then the questions are full-time versus part-time. Are we talking about an individual, or do you want to bring in a group of people to fulfill a deliverable? So an example, we were asked to do a full development program for a big pharma to get a couple of products to proof of concept, because they didn't have the internal resource, but they didn't want to create an entire department to do that. It's that sort of a deliverable context. And then obviously we have contract research organizations too. I want to say no more about that. What I want to do is to go into sort of look at the recruiter types. And Soraya, when you're dealing with your clients, where do you draw the line? How do you approach that in terms of fit for purpose in the whatever circumstance a company finds itself?
Well, I think it sort of segues nicely into what you were talking about previously, Paul, in terms of how do you view talent and the outcomes that you're looking for. So I think, it's always thinking about hiring for will and not for skill. So it's about that mindset that people bring to the table. And I think that's really important in terms of when you're developing your culture and your talent pool, and that will come in many diverse ways. So I think you can't just view talent as a permanent hire. I think, as you've mentioned, there's types of talent that you can utilize, but they will still always add something to your culture. So I think it's, you have to ask those questions around behaviors and values and what does that individual bring to the table. But you should ask that even if it's not a permanent hire, even if it's a consultant, because they're still representing your organization and protecting your reputation, as it were. And so you need to think about that in terms of the talent, but also with the partners that you're working with to help you bring that talent in.
In terms of the, how do you advise them in terms of what route to go? I know it's how long is a piece of string, but I mean, we talk about retained search, we talk about contingency, we talk about posting things on LinkedIn, etc. What are the I'll come to you, Sean, because I think perhaps this is an area that you're front line on. What does each option give you? Sean? Hello?
On mute. Sorry, 2023, and I'm still leaving myself on mute. Terrible. So yeah, what do we want to look at in terms of results and what kind of actions we want to look at? I think firstly, what kind of teams we have. Are we doing it internally first from a kind of a culture perspective? You know, are we allowing our people the opportunity to be able to promote within first, or, you know, like from your picture, to take a lateral move? If we are then going to recruit a new position or bring a kind of extra headcount in, have we given like a referral scheme for people to be able to do so? Is that an option for us to be able to do that? Do we know people from our own kind of talent sourcing pool that we've had available in the past, that we've spoken to? Because I think that's something that should always be done: communicating, connecting, speaking to people in your network. If you're a software engineering company, it's always in your best interest to be speaking to software engineers in one way or another, to be building a network, and that helps when you're going to be recruiting further on down the line. You know, I'm not recruiting for any software engineers at the moment, but you can better believe that I'm speaking to multiple, you know, at any one given time, because, you know, I know that we're going to eventually be recruiting, and it's nice to stay connected to stuff that's going on in the market anyway. Once you've gone through there, you know, you want to get your own internal process, set up adverts. Where are you looking to be set up? You know, is it just LinkedIn? Is it job boards? Is it all across different kind of, you know, are you using One Nucleus, for example? You know, are you going to connect yourself on there? I think there's so many options you can go to. But again, like when we talk about circumstance, posting an advert is a large monetary cost. You know, posting an advert on LinkedIn is a large monetary cost. If you're going to spend all that money there and you don't really have that kind of affordability, should you potentially look at an agency? Yes. You know, all depends on size as well. I hope that kind of gives a bit of a brief.
Yeah. Can we go to the next slide, please? Because I think we're going to go into a bit more detail. And this goes about, you know, picking the right one. And I wanted to come to Rosie on this one, because you know, we talk about the what's the right time. Has this ever gone wrong for you guys?
Yeah, I think I've certainly experienced it in the past when I've been part of an organisation that's going through a lot of change or a period of growth, and existing partners that they've worked with have perhaps not quite understood the journey that the organisation is going on, or the changes that are happening. And then, you know, to the point I raised before around recruiters being a really critical kind of PR piece for you actually as an organisation when you're talking externally, they struggle to do that in a good way. And I think that's just kind of an example that comes to mind, where actually it's really important to go back and revisit who your partners are, because they may not always be right for your organisation forever. And I think to kind of if you've got a plan of kind of what talent you want and sort of where you're going to source that from and who your partners might be, I think that could quite change quickly if you as a business are moving in a different direction. So I think being open to reviewing actually who those partners are, depending on where you're going as an organisation, is quite important as well. And I know, you know, some organisations do that in quite a structured way, and they might on an annual basis look at their PSL, or that may just be something that happens organically at a point in time where you have gone through that kind of period of change.
Thank you. Soraya, in terms of the questions we have here at the bottom line, which is trying to find a way of triaging your recruiters, have I missed anything in terms of what the sort of questions you should be asking of the recruiting agency?
Yeah, I think there's some practicalities around reading the small print of their terms. I think that's really, really important. You know, you don't want to get caught out in terms of, you know, if something does go wrong, and we hope it doesn't, you know, what kind of rebates do they have? What kind of replacements do they have? There's the cultural piece about how they perform and how they support your recruitment process and are complementary to your culture. But I think there's that you know, really practical bit around the terms, you know, like Rosie said, around, you know, you may review your PSL yearly, or that might happen organically, you know, through one recruitment cycle, and you review, you know, the performance, and you might have whatever metrics are appropriate that you see fit to look at. But I think, you know, read the small print, don't get tied in, because I think, you know, it can hamstring you in terms of, you know, you mentioned it earlier, Paul, that, you know, you might have direct applicants, but there's a small print that says that actually if you've engaged a recruiter, they're going to have to then go and triage, and then they get a fee. for a
Yeah.
role they haven't directly sourced. So I think, you know, really understanding the terms and really understanding how that could impact your process and you know, your future relationship with that recruiter as well, because, you know, it just takes one bad, you know, one tough conversation over a fee and a relationship can break down. So I think, you know, just being really clear about the practicalities of the terms that you're signing up to early doors is really, really key as well.
I would add to that, and I think you sort of alluded to it, is what do they do when your candidate who you've recruited doesn't work out, and what sort of time scale will that hangover period last? Because you know, if they say, right, if they don't last a year, we'll replace for free, that's great. But if they say if they leave within over 3 months, you know, hard cheese, I think that's your relationship needs to be reviewed with your recruiter. Anyway, can we go to the next slide, please? And this brings us down to the penultimate question, which is about the synergistic relationship. And I think most of the people on the panel have had experience with working with groups who are become very closely aligned and almost embedded in your organization, but things change. And you know, the last couple of minutes we've talked about making sure that those reviews are thorough and robust, because your recruiter, it may be an individual, and that individual may move on or retire, or it may be with a group, and the question is, are they fit for purpose in all circumstances? So the other thing I wanted to address is in terms of the circumstances, do you need one or more recruiters? So Soraya, you know, this is your very much your area of competence. How does synergy work? Does it work in all circumstances? Why is it important? And what options should you take into consider on every recruitment occasion?
I think it's, you know, recognizing that if you're going to engage a partner to work with you on this role, they're representing your organization. So I think, you know, you can't just sling them a job description and hope for the best. You know, Sean used the phrase earlier, spray and pray, because nobody has a good experience, you know, from the HR person or the talent acquisition person through to the hiring manager, and it certainly doesn't bode well for the candidate. So I think, you know, having that open, trusted relationship around, you know, without going into too much detail, why are you hiring for the role? Go beyond what's written down on the job description. You know, what does the team look like? What's it going to look and feel like for the individual? You know, be really open about what the reality of the role is, I think, because, you know, a good recruiter will really, really do the legwork for you, and they'll be worth their weight in gold and the substantial fee that you're going to pay them for them to, you know, we're paying them to kind of screen those candidates to a point where you want to be going, this is going to be a hard decision. I've got 5 great candidates and I don't know who to offer to, because they all bring something to the table. So I think, you know, the better brief you give your recruiter, and the more trusting relationship you have with them, you know, it's that open communication. Give them feedback, you know, what wasn't right, you know, make sure that they're passing that feedback down onto candidates. I personally sort of keep recruiters on a pretty tight leash. You know, I'll tell them the process, I'll tell them the timelines, I'll tell them the expectation, and I'll most certainly give them feedback on what they're not doing and how I need to see better. So I think, you know, you're trusting them with the reputation of your organisation. So don't keep them at arm's length and see them as a necessary evil. They're complementary to you, and I think that's really, really important. And I think certain recruiters will be in a niche therapeutic area or a niche type of practice or a niche skill set. So being clear about that not all recruiters are born equal. They, you know, if you need a headhunt for a senior C-suite level role, go to those specialists, because they will have very good screening processes, you know, to really get into the candidate and their motivation through leadership development, what have you. And then, you know, just thinking about what's appropriate, but I think try and keep it, as Sean said earlier, actually quite exclusive. because what you don't want is multiple recruiters contacting one candidate.
Absolutely.
And then it turns into a bit of a bun fight that you don't need to have, and again it becomes a bad experience for that candidate. So I think be clear about what your levels are in terms of what you're recruiting, and being clear on who your specialists are. So not sure I've answered everything you want there.
No, absolutely, Sarah. And you picked up a number of points, and one of the things that I wanted to say about if you've got a recruiter, keep them close. It is an iterative process. I mean, a lot of recruiters will give you an initial candidate to make sure that they've got the criteria right, and that's a very useful first pass tool. And the other thing is, and I saw this so many times, word gets out that you're recruiting. So as well as your recruiter, you're going to get CVs thrown at you, some of which are also going to come through your recruiter. Ignore the CVs that are coming out randomly. You wait till the recruitment process with the recruiter is finished. Otherwise, you'll end up potentially paying 2 fees, and that's something you don't want. Okay, can we, I'm going to come to Rosie briefly. Just a quick question. Do you actually have a hierarchy in terms of recruiters? You know, and I've mentioned to you senior, pivotal, mid-level, technical, and operational. Do you have that running list?
No, we don't. And I think exactly what Sora just relayed, in that we have partners that, you know, I would work exclusively with on a majority of roles, but actually if you build those good relationships with them, they understand when you come to them and say, we have this opportunity and we don't think that that's your specialism or your niche, and you're open about that, and that's fine. And we don't do it by hierarchy at all, because some of our partners can absolutely deliver on all of those levels. It tends to go by kind of the particular technical expertise that may be a challenge for some partners than others, and we may choose to go to someone a bit more specialist. So I don't think I don't find it helpful to do it that structured. I think it
I completely agree with you, and that's why I asked the question. Indeed, as a recruiter, if they've got a good relationship with you and they don't feel they're going to do an excellent job, they will recommend to you who you should go to on occasion. And I think that's part of the relationship element, is that it's mutual trust amongst other things. Do you agree?
Yeah, no, I agree with that, definitely.
Okay, next slide, and it's not quite the what was on the agenda, but essentially I think one of the things that I found from obviously being a candidate as well as looking for candidates is that we have to always consider what it looks like from the candidate side. I do like this particular cartoon, because it's not everything. It's not all about the money. And particularly, I found with the people who we laughingly call millennials, they're looking for a work-life balance as much as they're looking for a nice little salary package, etc., etc. So consider what, one thing that if things go pear-shaped, it's a really great teaching tool. That doesn't necessarily mean that you want it. So in your experience, Rosie, does your team system always work with the candidate in mind? And how do you control the in-house staff involved to ensure that the candidate experience is good?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we are quite flexible with our process, actually, to accommodate the candidate needs. And we've had some recruitment processes where we've had to, kind of do a very fast process and see lots of people in a short amount of time, versus actually a very drawn out process over several months, because that's kind of the types of candidates that we're building relationships with. So I think we definitely maintain a very flexible approach to what those recruitment processes need to look like, and we will advise the hiring managers and on kind of what that may need to look like. And I think that's really important to do that, because it's, not every role is going to attract different kinds of candidates with different expectations. So it is a challenge to manage that. But I equally think if you fix a process, and I've worked in organizations where it's very structured, and they won't, they don't close a role until a certain period, and interviews have to happen in this particular time frame. And I think if you do that, you inadvertently exclude potentially really strong candidates by being quite fixed on that. So I do think it's important that you keep that, the candidate needs in mind.
I just a personal experience, I once had a recruitment exercise that took 18 months. Now, normally speaking, that's untenable, but the candidate of choice was actually rejected by the wife of one of the, shall we say, academic groups that were attached to this particular recruitment at the last minute. So we effectively had to start all over again, which is not good. But that goes to the point about trying to control who are the decision makers in terms of that recruitment. So Soraya, do you provide a sort of a game plan on how that process should look internally, and how do you change the culture in an organization that Rosie's just described, which was a bit rigid?
Yeah, well, I think you've got a compelling case of losing talent that you want, because again, I go back to my cliche of time kills all deals. So I think you're always going to have a compelling case of going, look, we didn't move quick enough, this was our ideal candidate. If you're being too rigid, you're going to lose out on actually that diversity of, and I go back to it, but it's that diversity piece is really, really important, especially in the life sciences sector, where the science is really hard, the work we do is important. So getting those brilliant minds who really want to solve these challenges is really important. So if you are inflexible and you ask the same, can you give me an example of a time when question, people will rehearse that. You're not really going to get to the core of people's motivations, their skills, their experiences. They're not going to be invigorated to want to join your organization. So I think you've got really compelling evidence of going, this hasn't worked. You've had these roles open for X amount of time, you're not getting the flow of candidates that you would like to see. Let's change the experience, because it's kind of the definition of insanity, doing the same thing expecting a different result. So actually you have to change the experience, because you want a better candidate experience, managers need to have a better experience when hiring, and you want the two to meet. So I think you've got compelling evidence to go, this hasn't worked, just look at the numbers, or look at your Glassdoor reviews, as horrid or as useful as they may be. I have mixed emotions around that, but I think you've got compelling data, you've got you've got that holistic kind of view of it, and so if managers really believe in building their teams and wanting to retain their talent, they have to change the experience, for themselves but also for the candidate.
A corollary question going to making sure that process is an experience is great for a candidate. Who should be in control of that internally? Should it be one individual who takes responsibility for shuffling the roles and the interviewing processes and making an ultimate decision? Right, what we've got is good enough. Let's crack on and get to the end game.
Well, I think that there's a couple of owners here. I think your talent acquisition team and your HR team need to support, coach and advise that process, because there's some things that we have to think of around how we screen candidates, diversity, gender pay, all those sort of slightly more they're not rigid, but they're compliance things. Let's call it governance, things that we have to think about. So HR really needs to support, coach and advise that process. But ultimately, it is the hiring manager. They are going to be responsible for that, supporting that individual's performance, supporting the success of that role and delivery of the goals. So really, there's owners to that process. Your talent team, and that is made up of HR, recruitment, your recruitment partners, but equally, ultimately, it's the hiring manager and that ultimate decision maker as to who gets hired for that role. So I think being prepared to work in partnership across those pieces is really, really important. We know that people will have differing views, but understanding where the ownership is and lies is really, really important.
And I think that that is a critical point. I'm going to go into wrap-up mode now because we've had a long, I hope informative discussion here. I'm going to go to each of the panel members to say some final thoughts. I'll go alphabetically. So Rosie first.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of topic of discussion today just reiterates the importance of putting thought behind the recruitment process and who your partners are, and feeding that into your wider strategy around where you get your talent from and ultimately what you're aiming for. And I think we've also talked on some of the challenges in the current environment externally, but also as an organisation facing challenges as you kind of grow or change. And I think it's a balancing act between thinking strategically, but also trying to meet immediate needs and challenges that we're faced with.
Thank you. So Sean.
Yeah, similar thoughts to Rosie, if I'm honest. There's a lot of need for listening to your people, listening to your candidates come in, being flexible with your processes, understanding there isn't just one process and it can be adaptable, and it needs to be adaptable per role. You need to work in collaboration with your hiring managers, with your externals, with the people that you're going through this process with, to ensure that candidates have a good experience, because at the end of the day, if you don't have a good experience, there's no point talking about recruitment because you're not going to be able to recruit anyone. So making sure that it's positive, you work in collaboration with the right people, and it's created a positive experience for people is something that needs to be looked at. Having a process from A to Z, not just A to B, that goes from when they start, when you're hiring, when they start, when they're there, even an exit interview process, for the whole ecosystem of hiring and getting someone on board. I think needs to be looked at when you start looking at, as a company, hiring.
Thank you. And Soraya?
I think it just to really sum up what Rosie and Sean have said, I think about what you're doing and why you're doing it. If you recruit in haste, you will repent at leisure. And I think ultimately, remember to read the small print.
And I will finally say, because we've danced through this process both from a strategic and tactical level, but for me, it's always consider the candidate, because ultimately you're dealing with people's lives and aspirations, and you have to be clear that they understand what they're getting into, both the culture as well as the job set, and that the fit is right for them, because if it's not and they leave, it's not a good place to be. And on that salutary note, I'm going to stop and say thank you very much to the panel, and thank you for sticking with us, those of you who have stuck with it. And Jasmine, back to you.
Thank you so much, Paul and Rosie, Sean and Soraya. It was really interesting session and some great takeaways there. We will be back in half an hour for our next session, and that is on the topic of how do we bring in diversity from bench to boardroom. Please continue to make yourself familiar with the app, and we will have voting open for the award until midday. So thank you all again, and
bye everybody.
see you at the next session.
Bye-bye.
Bye everybody, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye.